Welcome to the Iyer Clinic videos. Today we'll be discussing one of the most common problems in the American society today, one of the biggest healthcare crises, and that is obesity and diabetes. And since this is such a big topic, we're going to do it as a multi-part series. Today is Obesity and Diabetes Part 1. Obesity is one of the biggest problems in American society today. Strangely enough, the reason why there is so much diabetes today and the reason why we are obese today goes back all the way to our caveman ancestors, and that is hidden inside a certain genetic phenotype called the thrifty gene. And I have written this out here as feast, famine, the thrifty gene, and the caveman's dilemma. Essentially, our forefathers were cavemen, and these ancestors of ours did not do any agriculture. They had no means of growing their own food. They literally hunted and gathered. They gathered the fruit as it fell from the trees. Sometimes they had to climb it. They picked nuts, or they hunted the animals as they migrated in the ancient plains. And in the cold season, when winter came and the grounds were covered with snow, there was no fruit to pick, there were no nuts to gather, and the herds had migrated down south to the warmer climates. So our ancestors had only one choice before them. Either they moved with the herds, in essence they became nomads, or if they had established a place of residence in a cave of some kind and they had a tribe that could not move, they were stuck. They had to survive winter with little or no food, or whatever food they could store. And in the caveman era, they did not have much expertise in storage technology either. They did not know how to store their food well enough to preserve it for long periods. So they were completely dependent on an existing food supply. Not surprising, each winter, only those of our ancestors who could survive the winter with little or no food survived to live to see the summer and procreate and pass on their genes to their children. And so we have inherited that thrifty gene, the gene that is geared entirely to survive. And that is, it's a highly economical gene, and that is one way of saying it actually is a set of processes that controls how the body uses energy. Essentially, the thrifty gene is manifested by a certain type, and that is people who carry the thrifty gene, and it right now is prevalent in large segments of the population, will put on weight very quickly in times of plenty and lose it quickly when they need to survive on only their stored fat. That is, only those of our caveman ancestors who could put on fat very quickly in times of plenty survived the lean period. So what genetic property or the set of biochemical and metabolic properties that was an advantage for the caveman became a disadvantage when food supply became constant. In our current world, we don't see feast and famine. We don't see, for the most part in the developed country, we don't see large periods where food is not available to large segments of the population. So food is now a constant. So now the same mechanisms that produce survival for the caveman now produce obesity for the modern man. So in essence, therefore, the diabetic trait or type 2 diabetes as it is prevalent in the US population and in the rest of the world is an ancient survival strategy that is no longer an advantage. What was once an advantage now manifests as a metabolic problem that is the hallmark of the thrifty gene and the diabetic phenotype. Let us talk about diabetes and obesity from a different standpoint, and that is talking about it as a furnace, with the body as a furnace. If you were to consider the body as a furnace, then a furnace is dependent, the efficiency with which a furnace functions is dependent on the fuel, on how quickly, on how regularly you supply the fuel, and how efficiently you burn the fuel. In diabetics patients, their body metabolic state can be compared as a furnace heating a home. But the thing is, a patient with either obesity, the syndrome X, or the diabetes straight, their furnace is as if it's a wood burning furnace, wood or coal burning furnace. And if you were to take a wood or coal burning furnace, and instead of putting wood and coal, you put gasoline, you would get an explosion, not a clean burning fire. And this is where it becomes imperative in the dialogue about diabetes to understand the fuels that people consume. Gasoline and wood are both chemical compounds. Both will, when ignited, will release their chemical energy as heat and light. The only difference is gasoline will release all its energy in one explosive second. Wood, on the other hand, will release its energy over 7 to 8 hours. In the same way, in a diabetic patient, their metabolism acts as if it's a wood-burning furnace. And instead of placing foods that are like wood, long-burning, slow-burning foods, if you were to feed them high-energy carbohydrates, high sugar-rich compounds, white rice, these things are the gasoline foods of our food supply, and they produce the phenomenon of glucose overload in terms of overwhelming their metabolic capacity with the amount of fuel that they have been given. So continuing on this paradigm of the nature of the fuel versus the capacity of the furnace, let's take this analogy a little bit further. The way a furnace would burn is determined not only on the type of fuel you put, but also on the rate of supply of the fuel. So if you were to overwhelm the furnace with fuel or not put the fuel in an efficient manner, in a timely manner, you're going to have an irregularly burning furnace. Lastly, once the fuel is put, if you don't provide adequate oxygen, adequate conditions for combustion, you'll again have a decrease in your combustion efficiency, and you'll have toxic waste products being burned. You'll have a lot of smoke, and the burn is not going to be a clean burn, and the furnace is not going to be efficient. Now, if you take these concepts and move them on to the human body, you can see how all of this fits in the way people live. For this, I draw the figure of a metabolic table. And in this, the best analogy is to consider our metabolism as if it's a table with 4 legs. And this metabolic table, the 4 legs, all these 4 legs have to be equally balanced for the table to be level. Too much reliance on management of only one leg versus another leg, or unequal distribution of resources to any one of the 4 legs, results in the metabolic table being out of balance and teeter-tottering. The 4 legs are as follows: the sleep-wake cycle, when a person goes to bed and when the person wakes up; the fasting-feeding cycle, when the person eats and when he doesn't eat, and the interval between meals; what the person eats, what you eat, and what you burn and how you burn it. And these are the 4 legs of the metabolic table. Now, everyone knows about the 3rd leg, what you eat and what you burn. This is a billion-dollar industry. The Nike, the Adidas, all the sports industry, and all the Jenny Craigs and all the diet companies focus on this, and this is not a bad point to focus on. But if you focus on only these two legs, and these two legs are located diagonally across my analogy of the metabolic table, you will have a table that is out of balance, which is why people yo-yo all the time through diets. Everyone knows how much importance there is about activity, and everyone knows about dieting, but they all neglect this part. When they go to bed and when they wake up, they all neglect the timing and quantity and intervals between their meals. And this, in essence, determines the entire diabetic state. Few people realize this, but you can literally manage all of diabetes if you regularize these 4 legs. Why is this so? The sleep-wake cycle determines when you turn your metabolic engine on or off. When you go to sleep, your metabolic engine is at a low level. When you wake up, it turns on. By timing your fuel and rate of supply of fuel to your sleep-wake cycle, you can ensure that you never trigger this thrifty gene from switching on. And I'll come to that in a moment. The fasting feeding cycle determines when you have your meals, what are the interval between meals, and are the timing of these meals and the quantities synchronized to your body's ability to use the fuel, the rate of supply. If you supply your meals irregularly to your furnace, if you supply your meals too quickly one after another to the furnace, more than its rate of management of those meals, or more than the speed at which your metabolism can handle those meals, you will end up being obese. I don't need to dwell too much on what you eat or what you burn. Everyone seems to know this. I'll touch on it briefly in part 2. Let me explain one more concept before we end this little part 1 talk, and we'll consider all of this again in part 2. The thrifty gene, which I talked about, which is what I call the survival against starvation gene, is an extraordinary set of processes that are triggered to drive the entire metabolism to energy conservation. That is, when this thrifty genes, when the enzyme processes governed by the thrifty gene genotype is triggered, the metabolism shifts dramatically towards energy conservation. It will not burn the food. The number one thing that triggers the thrifty gene to switch on is lack of food supply. Now I'll leave everyone with this thought. I always invariably get ladies coming to my clinic and telling me this: Doc, I don't eat anything. I get up in the morning, I have a cup of coffee, I don't have my breakfast, and I will go to work, I'll have another cup of coffee at work, I don't even have a lunch, maybe a little smoothie there, but I don't eat anything. I come home and I have my only meal is at 7 o'clock. And I don't eat all through the day, and still I'm putting on weight. I'm so heavy. I don't know what to do. I have done all the tests, all my metabolism, I have the right amount of hormones, my thyroid is normal. I don't know why I'm so fat, doc. How can I help? How can you help me? And guess what? This lady has been switching on the thrifty gene from the minute she woke up. The minute you wake up, if you don't eat a minimum of 300 calorie breakfast, within 1 hour of switching on your engine, which is waking up, then you switch on the thrifty gene. And once the thrifty gene is switched on, it functions for 18 hours. And it will then take every morsel of food that you put in your belly and drive it directly into fat, into conservation. It will not burn it. And it's a very simple logic. The body says, I don't know when my mistress is going to feed me. I can't trust her to feed me on a regular time. So this time, whatever food she's going to give, I'm not going to burn it. I'm going to suck it away. Think of this, everyone, when you think of your next diet. Thank you, and we'll meet again soon for part 2 of obesity and diabetes.